Oath and the Office podcast starring Professor Corey Brettschneider. I am John Fugelsang. There is no emergency in Washington, D.C., but the guy who had D.C. cops beaten for a lie is calling out the National Guard for all that D.C. crime. I am so pleased to welcome to you Professor Corey Brettschneider, constitutional law scholar, political scientist, and author whose work has always examined the balance between liberty and democratic governance. He is the author of The Oath and the Office and The Presidents of the People. And today we're going to talk about the growing militarization of federal power, attacks on judicial independence, manipulation of official statistics, and the looming threat to marriage equality. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a man just honored by the American Bar Association with the Silver Gavel Award for his work defending the rule of law, Professor Corey Brettschneider. Hello, sir.
Thanks so much, John. What a pleasure to be with you, and what a group of topics we have. I mean, this, militarization of the D.C., of the governance of Washington, D.C., the use of the military in L.A. We've been talking throughout this podcast about the idea of a self-coup, the president taking over the other branches. And that so far has had a kind of subtle dimension, what sometimes is called a soft coup, not violence. But now as the military comes out, it looks like we're moving more towards a coup, towards a hard coup, as political scientists talk about it. And of course, these other assaults on democracy, on the judiciary, Judge Boasberg's attempt to get justice through contempt hearings, so important. I'm glad we're going to cover that.
Well, we're going to cover all of it. I'm
And
excited for it.
looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, but you did a good job, Professor, of glossing over the fact that I congratulated you on receiving the Silver Gavel Award from the American Bar Association. I'm sorry. I'm just a mook here. I'm the guy who cheats off your paper in class, but it feels especially urgent, Corey, at a time when democracy is facing all these assaults. Can you just tell us a bit about what this award represents, both for you personally and for the broader fight to protect that quaint old chestnut we call the rule of law?
Well, I wrote The Presidents and the People, 5 leaders who threatened democracy and the citizens who fought to defend it, because I saw, unfortunately, the danger of not just this president, but of the presidency itself to American democracy. The framers imagined a good person, a person of virtue and power, but the book is about the question of what happens and what happened in the past when people who really assault American democracy take power. And that vulnerability we're seeing every single day in every single one of those issues that we're going to talk about today. And so to be honored by not just any organization, but one of the leading organizations standing up for the rule of law, and the American Bar Association has been that, with their Best Book Award, basically, for books about law, was really an honor. And I went with my wife. I received the award. I spoke about the book. And I was introduced by the ABA president, who has been standing up to Trump, in particular, standing up to him when it comes to his assault on law firms, and including the members of the American Bar Association to stand up and not to cave. And really, that peer pressure that you get, I think, is responsible for those law firms who have fought back, and for there being fewer than there would have been of the law firms caving in. And of course, they've been huge critics of unqualified judges taking power, so much so that Trump has stripped them of the ability to look at the files of these judges. And so they refused to even opine on Judge Beauvais, an obviously unqualified member. And they said, look, if you're not going to show us the file, we're certainly not going to endorse him. And so this organization is not meant to be political. It's really devoted to the profession of law. But when the law is under assault, they have stood up with statements and with action. And so to be honored by them with their Silver Gavel Book Award. It is like a judge gavel inscribed
Right
with the details of the book. It was a true honor, probably the biggest honor of my professional career.
Wow. My producer, Chris, won't stop singing Maxwell's Silver Gavel in your honor. But Corey, can I just ask one more question? I want to get into National Guard deployed to D.C., but before I do, as long as we're talking about the ABA, I mean, they have now said that defending the rule of law is now a priority. I would have assumed that was always their priority. Corey, what does that tell us about where the legal profession thinks the country is right now? That the ABA says their priority is defending the rule of law.
That was the theme of the conference, and I think the book's theme fit extremely well. And I had an opportunity to not just receive the award, but to talk to the president of the ABA, who is devoted to defending the rule of law. And that might have just sounded like any ordinary slogan several years ago. Of course, that's what the ABA is about. That we're not ruled by a king; we're ruled by law in this country. And yet with Trump's assault on democracy, it takes on a different meaning, that it really is about defending judges, and many of whom were in attendance at this event and who I had the opportunity to meet, who have faced threats from Donald Trump going way back to his assault on the ethnicity of a judge who was looking at one of his cases in the first term, to his, which we'll talk about coming up, his Justice Department's really investigation of a judge just doing his job. And they see themselves as defending the law. And in this moment they're not a partisan organization, but certainly it requires them to be fierce in their opposition to what this administration is doing. And as sad as it is, this isn't a normal presidency. I wrote a piece in 2016 that really sums it up, called Trump versus the Constitution. And this isn't a partisan argument. It's about protecting the foundations of our democracy from a president who would destroy it. And they have been at the forefront of that fight, as has the ACLU, who we've, of course, profiled often and had as a guest Mike Zamor 2 times, and other organizations that are really doing what it takes. And so when people say, where's the hope come from? It's groups like the ABA that are stepping up.
Well, I got to say, as someone who never took the bar, this podcast is sort of like my unofficial free law school, and I love cheating off your paper. But we got to talk about what's happening right now in D.C. We have a lot of topics to get to. Corey, on August 11th, Donald Trump, the man who suggested once maybe nuking hurricanes, he woke up, he waddled to a podium for a press conference and declared he is seizing control of Washington, D.C.'s police force and deploying the National Guard into the city. Now, lowest crime in 30 years in D.C. The homicide rate is down 32% in 2024. Trump cherry-picked 2023 numbers, okay, slapped them next to a couple of wildly inaccurate comparisons, and suddenly he's saying D.C. was worse than Bogota or Mexico City or other places filled with brown people that he thinks sounds scary. But then, Corey, came the Marie Antoinette part. He invoked Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, a legal tool no president has ever used, to seize control of the D.C. police and stick them under future disbarred Attorney General Pam Bondi's Real Housewives' eye. So, and then he deployed 800 National Guard troops to assist law enforcement, which in practice means standing around, blocking traffic in D.C. and looking bored while occasionally yelling at teenagers on a scooter. Corey, these are men and women in the Guard pulled from their families, their jobs, and their actual communities to do what? Like arrest imaginary ATV gangs in DuPont Circle? Like to pose for Trump campaign ads? You'd think he was freeing the city from alien invaders, but all he's doing apparently is freeing it from a crime wave that only exists in the Fox News cinematic universe. So you just said it, we're witnessing the shift from soft coup to hard coup. He tried this in LA. It was pathetic and it petered out. Could you unpack what you mean by hard coup? You already mentioned it once in the show, but in the context of the military takeover of police powers and the use of the FBI for local enforcement when the locality has not asked for the help.
Absolutely. And the use of the military in particular is so dangerous and crucial here. I've been talking about what's happening throughout all of our Oath in the Office podcasts as a self-coup, meaning it's not a takeover from the outside, but it's the use of presidential power to destroy the other branches, through DOJ, for instance, to destroy the Congress and usurp its allocation power, spending power. We've seen attacks on the judiciary. So that idea of the self-coup is that it happens from the inside of the government, from the chief executive. But so far, the way that that's been happening is not through the use of force, through coercion. It's been through more subtle means and through policy and through executive orders. But what's happening now is really a shift. As you see him using the military, as you said, in DC and in LA, it's becoming more of what political scientists sometimes call a hard coup, that there is a kind of violent threat underneath all of this. Now, I'll give some hope. I think that's the danger. The framers, themselves worried about the standing army because it would shut down civil liberties. And the opposite of that, and the way they guaranteed against that too, was by putting in protection. And the protection is local government is in charge of policing in this country.
Yes.
Our 10th
Yes.
Amendment says those powers not given to the federal government, and there is no general police power or power of creating a police force given to the federal government, are reserved to the states. And so part of the hope here, as much as we're talking about the threat, we always talk about the hope, is that Gavin Newsom is suing the Trump administration and has been, to my mind, making quite an argument that there's an illegal use of force in LA. And we'll talk about how that relates to LA too. But sorry, John, you wanted to jump in there.
Oh, I want to jump in. I need to ask you about a lot of what you just said. First off, Washington, D.C. is, of course, in a different constitutional space than the states. Can you explain why the president has such massive authority there and how D.C. statehood might change this equation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, part of why Newsom has been so successful in pushing back is because there are actually limits on the use of military force in federal law. There are limited authorities that Trump is relying on. They're really bogus authorities. That's why he keeps talking, for instance, about the fake idea that they're just defending buildings when we know that they've been involved in policing. And what Newsom is doing is using that limited federal authority combined with that 10th Amendment power of the states to say, hey, you can't push us around. In our system, there's a notion of dual sovereignty. The federal government has sovereignty, but so do the states. The states don't work for the federal government. And that's the basis of Newsom's lawsuit. It's why I think there's a good chance that he's going to win. But now we could see the danger of the DC takeover and also get an insight into why Trump is looking to Washington, D.C., because, of course, Washington, D.C. is not a state. And so all those state sovereignty arguments that Newsom is able to use, we're not seeing in D.C. And in fact, the mayor is largely going along with what Trump is saying, because she thinks that although there is a Home Rule Act, there are some ways of making the argument. She clearly thinks she's not as on firmer ground as Newsom. What does that tell us about the future and the need to recover our democracy? It tells us that there's a serious problem aside from just the representation problem of D.C. not being a state, but it lacks the sovereignty that would allow it to resist federal tyranny. And that's another, I think, compelling reason at this moment to start thinking about the need for Washington, D.C. to become a state.
Exactly right. I mean, let me just run through a couple of stats here. In Donald Trump's ranting, he's saying that other blue cities are crime-ridden hellholes like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Baltimore, Oakland. Here are the top 5 cities with the highest murder rates in the United States, Corey. Jackson, Mississippi, 77.2 murders per 100,000. Number 2, Gary, Indiana. Number 3, Birmingham, Alabama. Number 4, Memphis, Tennessee. Number 5, St. Louis, Missouri. The top 5 cities with the highest murder rates are all red states. All of them. So if DC had statehood right now, how could they alter the federal government's ability to come in there, lie about why they're seizing control and taking over the local law enforcement?
They would, have a lot more power under our Constitution to say this is a usurpation of our legal rights. So what Newsom is saying in California is the federal government's authority is very limited in relation to the states when it comes to traditional areas like policing and arresting citizens. I think he's going to win that case. If DC was a state, they would be able to make all of those arguments. And in fact, I'm not even sure Trump would have targeted them in the way that he is. The whole reason why he's seeking to take over, to militarize Washington, D.C., is because he knows it's not a state and that the mayor really, although has some independence, is at the behest of the federal government. So he's a bully. And so he looks for easy targets. And Newsom turns out not to be an easy target at all. In fact, he's fighting back, not just on social media, where he's lately been pretty good, but in court, where I think he's going to win. And the federal government is going to suffer massive defeats. And there's already been some success in pushing back on his military action. He's certainly calling it out. And that just is not the case. D.C. is much, much weaker. The mayor of Washington, D.C. doesn't have anything like the power under the Constitution to resist that Newsom has. Part of it, too, just to emphasize what's obvious, you've said it, but I don't want listeners to miss it, is that the lying, he acts based on anecdote. So Big Balls, one of the Doge members, was
Oh, yes.
in an altercation. And that's
Yes.
enough for him to say that Washington, D.C. is out of control. He couldn't care less about the empirical evidence about the way the city is functioning as a whole, in which, as you say, the statistics are increasingly showing that it's safe. And his own administration has admitted that.
The
And yet,
most dangerous day in modern DC history was January 6th, 2021. I
right.
mean, and I guess did he get Nancy Pelosi to call out the guard for him finally?
The idea that somebody who created an incentive, who incited violence on that day with his speech at the Ellipse, who refused to call out the National Guard to stop it, is now all of a sudden concerned about safety in Washington, D.C. I don't think that's what's going on at all. And what all this amounts to pull back to the big picture, to return to our theme of the self-coup, is using the military to take over the city with, and this is crucial, with the aim of expanding beyond. Now, he's seen Newsom and the resistance there, but he thinks that if he can be successful in one city, that maybe all this pushback that he's getting from Newsom might not work. Now, that's why it just becomes that idea of the states resisting. We heard, for instance, from the Attorney General of New Mexico, who's doing so much to use the power of New Mexico and his alliance with other states, including governors from New York and California, to push back on birthright citizenship. That's got to be the architecture here for pushing back on this militarization, because as weak as Washington, D.C. might be, the states are not weak. They have the power to push back, and he's gearing up for a fight. He's not backing down.
That's right. So, I mean, this is not a coincidence either. You don't pick DC for your martial law dress rehearsal without knowing it's one of the blackest cities in America. I mean, this is about control. This is about fear. Homicide is down. Violent crime is down. Numbers don't lie, but Trump does. And again, he had DC cops beaten to the point of disability over a lie. And now he's got 800 National Guard troops pulled away from their families to patrol the city with the lowest crime rate in 3 decades. Pam Bondi controlling 3,000 DC cops like it's the Miss Florida pageant gone fascist. Trump, still using military power, not because of necessity, but because he's still trying to appeal exclusively to his own 32% of the electorate base. And all of this, Corey, conveniently timed to distract from the Epstein revelations that are never going to go away. So I'm with you. I'm really happy seeing Gavin Newsom challenging this federal takeover in court. I think if you want to run for president in 2026, you're better off doing that than playing kissy face on a podcast with Steve Bannon. It's just, it's more inspiring. But can I ask briefly, how does Newsom's legal strategy fit into the American tradition of state resistance to federal overreach? We're used to seeing our Republican friends being the states' rights guys resisting those encroaching feds. How does this Newsom's example fit into the tradition?
Well, I'm so glad that we have the space on this podcast to dive into not just what's happening, but to provide the wider context. And I think often when you look at history, as people ask, where's the hope? Well, you can see, how did we fight back in the past from federal tyranny? And we have an outline very early in the Republic. 1798, John Adams signs the Sedition Act, making it essentially a crime to criticize the president of the United States, but leaving it fine to criticize the vice president. Thomas Jefferson, the vice president, is a member of the opposition party. This is a law designed to shut down the opposition. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson, in letters to Madison and elsewhere, makes it very clear that he himself might be subject to arrest under the Sedition Act because he's such a critic of Adams. So now here's the question. How do you fight back in a circumstance like that? The courts were not going to save them. In fact, Samuel Chase, a Supreme Court justice, lobbied for this law. By the way, this is the same period that also gave us the Alien Enemies Act, which Trump was using to destroy due process in the Garcia case and elsewhere. So what do? They actually go to Virginia and they meet and they come up with a plan. They say we need to use the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which has been ratified, which I've been talking about, which says that the states have powers to resist unconstitutional action by the federal government. The federal government doesn't have generalized powers. It doesn't have generalized police powers. In particular, what they say is that gives us the ability to refuse to cooperate with the federal government as they demand the arrests of political opponents. Now, that's a nice way of understanding what's going on here, that we don't have to cooperate with the federal government, we the states, we the cities, as they seek to arrest what are essentially our political opponents, as they seek unconstitutional action through ICE, and as they seek militarization. That's going to be the strategy, I think, that matters most. And that's why Raul Torres, who joined us, and Newsom, who, despite his misguided flirtation with Nazis like Bannon, now is coming into his own and seeing the constitutional tools. It's so crucial that they fight back. And we also have to see and admit the weakness of Washington, D.C.'s response is
Oh,
part
yes.
because they don't have that power that the rest of these states do.
Well, then listen, we got to take a quick break. But when we come back, Corey, I want to ask about Pam Bondi's attacks on Judge Boasberg and what the ABA can do about all these attacks on the judicial system. I want to talk about Trump's war on math, which is a real thing, and the looming challenge to marriage equality. They're going after Obergefell. We'll be right back in just a moment with more of The Oath and the Office. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office, starring Professor Corey Brettschneider. I'm John Fugelsang. Corey, Trump just fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because the jobs report was weak. This president's version of great job numbers are numbers that make his ego feel better, not numbers that reflect reality. Now, where did the head of labor statistics go wrong? She oversaw the routine release of job numbers. That's it. July added only 73,000 jobs, way below expectations. May and June got revised downward by over 100,000 each. The economy is not booming. It is sputtering. It is gasping for air. And this president just fired the nation's top economic statistician like she forgot his fries because I guess nothing says stable genius like punishing math. So, as scary as this is and pathetic as this is, the Times reports the new head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is a Trump obedient loyalist, E.J. Antoni, who is known for ragingly partisan economic commentary, no objectivity, and someone who hates the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Corey, how dangerous can it get when an administration installs political flunkies in deliberately nonpartisan numbers and statistics agencies?
Wow, we started covering this last week and we saw the firing and we knew what was coming. And now we're seeing it in real time that what he's trying to do is to control and manipulate the truth and to eliminate it. In a democracy, the civil service is protected for a reason, which is that so many of them are charged with what are supposed to be neutral roles in providing the democracy information. What are the numbers about unemployment? What are the numbers about our labor force? We need those as citizens in order to make informed decisions. Now, we suspected and now we know that that firing was in order to put somebody in there who's going to lie about the numbers in order to serve Trump's agenda and to make him
Exactly.
look good. And that, is the military is such an obvious threat to democracy. Calling out the military, using it to police people, to replace the police who are charged with and trained, not that they always live up to this, but there are limits on what they do by the Constitution. The military, almost by its nature, is not a police force. It's not aware of these things. But so they are the threat, the violent threat, the hard coup aspect of this is pretty obvious. This is a little more subtle, not much, but it's about the control of truth.
Yeah.
I understand Romanian dictator Ceausescu at one point tried to ban higher math that he didn't understand. He wanted to control the very existence of numbers and mathematics to make 2 + 2 = 6 if he wanted. And that's what you're seeing here. And it is part of the Project 2025 playbook to try to take what was an independent civil service protected since the 19th century in its ability to provide neutral, factual information and destroy it and make it an arm, a propaganda arm of the White House. And who better to do it than this gentleman, this person that they're putting in there?
Boy, it sure would be tragic if Donald Trump ended up like Ceausescu, wouldn't it? And Ceausescu's lovely wife as well. Here's the crazy thing about this whole story, Corey. The person who actually calculates the jobs data isn't the head of the Bureau. It's a team of 2,000 career statisticians who have zero reason to lie. So Trump just fired a single woman for something that comes from an army of professionals. And he seems to think that he can put in one flunky who will then veto the numbers in-house. I mean, the whole country relies on the Bureau of Labor Statistics for reliable data, right? Investors, economists, policymakers, they depend on those numbers. Trump depends on his feelings. So, what happens, Professor, when the government's own official numbers on employment, on wages, on inflation, what happens when nobody can trust or rely on those numbers because it's completely politicized.
Well, it becomes, talking about with Attorney General Torres of the need to combine thinking about economic well-being with the Constitution and questions of democracy. This is it. If investors can't figure out what the real numbers are, if they're just being fed lies, that's going to lead to a lack of confidence in the markets. If American citizens, we can know in some way whether or not inflation has hit us hard or what the price of milk is, but we also look to the government to provide information about how things are going. So many people voted for Trump because of concerns about inflation. If we can't trust those numbers anymore, it's very hard to know how to react in a democracy. But that's exactly his point. And by the way, about the federal bureaucracy, I think they're well aware of the idea that there are civil servants that might undermine their attempt to take over the truth. And that's part of what Project 2025 was about, to look into that civil service, which they call, of course, the deep state. It actually is the brave people who are trying to just provide information to the rest of us, and to undermine it from the top. Now, will that succeed or not? I mean, we have so many civil servants, many of whom I'm in touch with, pushing back in all sorts of ways. But can they hang on?
Right.
I'm hopeful, but I'm not sure.
Do we have any historical parallels for this kind of manipulation of economic data? I mean, how have democracies responded to this sort of thing in history?
Well, I really been thinking about this, and I see a lot of parallels. I mentioned the Ceausescu example in foreign dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. In the Soviet Union, I think I mentioned this last week. One of the most important ideas that people like Václav Havel said in resisting was that we have to see that the worry isn't just the use of force, the kind of hard force that we were talking about in the previous segment, but the manipulation of truth, and to try to live in truth amidst a regime that's trying to create a blanket of lies and a system of agreeing about lies is a very hard thing to do. And that's what we're facing now. This is one example. Another one, by the way, which we haven't talked about, is the takeover of the Smithsonian, where they don't want information that makes Americans feel bad. In other words, they're erasing our history because they don't want us to see anything negative about America. Well, if
No, it's not even that. It's not even that. They don't want anything negative
slavery
about
is a
this
big part of
man.
the story.
They're
So
saying that they've changed. I mean, the Smithsonian now says only 3 presidents were ever in danger of being removed from office: Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton. I mean, they're literally erasing
yeah.
recent history. There's no precedent for this ever turning out well, is there, Professor? I mean, good guys in history have never done this, and the people who have done this, has it ever ended well? Ever?
I just can't find, I think if you look back in American history before the Pendleton Act to the mid 19th century, there was a tradition of hiring purely partisan individuals into the civil service. And around the 1880s, when the Pendleton Act is passed and signed, that's meant to be the process of saying, we're no longer going to do things that are, supposed to be about providing basic information. They're supposed to be neutral just through partisan politics. So that was different than what we're seeing now. This goes beyond it, but it's a kind of on steroids, harkening back to the politicization that we had before the Pendleton Act of the civil service. Now, the civil service wasn't that big in the 19th century, and it wasn't being manipulated in the same way that this president is. So I really think it's very hard. That's the closest parallel I can find to answer that question that you asked before in American history to what's happening now. But it really doesn't approach it. I think you have to look to authoritarian, even totalitarian regimes. And the way I understand totalitarianism is it's not just about dictatorship. It's about blanketing the population with a fake ideology, hiding the facts. And that's, I mean, I wish it was hyperbole, but that is the attempt to take over the truth for Trump's own purposes.
Yeah, their war on inconvenient truths never seems to stop. And I'd like to ask you quickly, Professor, before the next break, about Pam Bondi's attack on Judge Boasberg. He's the one who recently scheduled the contempt hearing in the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. She's calling for an investigation of this judge who they lied. The government lied. The DOJ fired their own lawyer who admitted he was sent away in error. They lied relentlessly. Now he's back, and Pam Bondi is trying to, I guess, in the wake of this humiliation, intimidate any other jurists from crossing them with the rule of law? I mean, what does this tell us about this growing trend of naked, obvious, pathetic political retaliation against the judiciary?
I mean, that's exactly putting it in the terms that it should be put in. If you go back to a previous episode, the first time we had Mike Zamor on, that Garcia case we're right in the midst of it. We heard from him, I think, the day after. Judge Boasberg said to the government, turn those planes around, that you are deporting people to this gulag in El Salvador without the basis in law. And they're entitled to due process, even though you're saying they're entitled to none. Now, what did they do? They sent the planes anyway. So the reason why this is relevant is because he was so appalled by that. And I don't think, by the way, he was acting heroically. He was doing his job. He said, you just disobeyed a court order from a federal court, a lawful, clear order. They claimed, by the way, it wasn't written, that he gave it as an oral directive. There's no difference in the law. And so he began to investigate contempt hearings. Who's responsible? And there's a possibility that somebody could go to jail for this. Now, an appellate court, unfortunately, that's sympathetic to Trump has blocked that for now. It's still ongoing. The full DC circuit is going to hear this case. But even if they lose in court, Bondi is not prepared to just argue in court. She needs to attack that judge that to her mind is attacking him. So it turns out that in this administration, if you investigate the Department of Justice, they investigate you. It's a pure retaliation.
That's it.
To enforce the law.
That's it. And now the judiciary has halted that contempt hearing. So how do you assess the court's willingness or reluctance to stand up to these pressures?
Well, Boasberg, I don't think is backing down. And so I take solace in that. And I was on MSNBC 2 nights ago with a retired judge who was speaking about the heroes in the judiciary like Boasberg, and I certainly agree. But I would push back a little. I was a little more skeptical about the idea that it's clear the judiciary is going to stand up to the administration, because so far what's happened is that we had a 3-judge panel that said, basically what the judiciary needs to do is defer to the president on matters of foreign policy. That's the rationale that was used for stopping this contempt hearing. That's exactly the wrong idea when it comes to an authoritarian administration. We've got to not trust them. We've got to question them. And the whole idea in our system is that the president is upheld to a rule of law that's above him or her. That's why we have a rule of law, not men, to go back to a phrase from the founding. And that was what Boasberg was saying. Now, this 3-judge panel is saying the opposite, defer to the administration. What's going to happen going forward? I'm not sure. The first thing that will happen is the full DC circuit, it looks like, will look at this. I hope they'll fine for Boasberg. But ultimately, look, let's face facts. It might go to the Supreme Court, and they have not been terrific on holding this president to account. So,
oh, you don't say.
To say the least. But at least we're getting, we do have heroes out there. We do have judges who are standing up. And we know that this fake investigation of Boasberg is purely in retaliation. And the more we cover it that way, the more we talk about it, the more light we shine on it, the less they'll be able to get away with attacking this judge for doing his job.
What's it going to take for state bars to start disbarring some of these people? And given the political pressures we're seeing on the courts and the legal institutions, Corey, what concrete steps should the ABA and individual lawyers be taking right now to defend basic democratic principles?
Well, the state bars have been receiving the message very clearly from the ABA that those who are violating the law, and frankly, I think Pam Bondi is Exhibit A in
yes,
her retaliation, need to, we have to look at their licenses. Pam Bondi is a license.
Yes.
Why does she deserve to have a license if her legal ethics is so out there? Now, just as they've responded to Judge Boasberg, let's not make any mistake. The administration has gone after the ABA. That's why I'm so proud to have been part of their conference, to have received this award, because the more you see the administration coming after you, and they've come after the ABA, stripping them of the ability to even look in judges' records to do their traditional job of assessing those records and talking about whether they're even have the most basic qualifications or not. By the way, this goes back to Clarence Thomas, who they said was not qualified, a really important move and correct move at the time. So they've got to do more of that, and they should continue to do what they're doing and to not be afraid or intimidated by this administration. And so far, that hasn't happened. We have a new ABA president coming in, and I expect she'll continue this fight.
The state of Arkansas disbarred Bill Clinton for denying he had an affair with the intern. While he was being stalked, like Bill Clinton faced more severe consequences from his state bar for that lie about adultery than we've seen with these lies that will get Americans killed.
I don't want listeners to miss, too, your brilliant phrase, which I don't think I've heard you use before, but you said something, I think, like future disbarred attorney general.
I'm glad you caught that. Thank you. I slipped that in. Yes.
And I really do love that. And I think the more we can think about both the past and how it helps us, but also part of the hope comes from the future. And the fact that the judgment of history is not going to be kind to people like Pam Bondi. To my mind, clearly, we've had some bad attorney generals. Nixon's attorney general, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
Indicted and convicted. And yet she really gives that period, that attorney general a run for his money. And yes, future disbarred attorney general Pam Bondi. I love it.
Well, Corey, we got to take another break, but when we come back, I really want to ask you about the threat to marriage equality. 10 years after Obergefell brought marriage equality to gay tax-paying American citizens, the court is been asked by one of our favorite sci-fi villains from comedy shows past to go ahead and ban these people. This is a wacky white trash story that is going to delight folks who despise the actual Jesus parts of the Bible. Okay, quick break. Right back with The Oath and the Office. I'm John Fugelsang. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office with Professor Corey Brettschneider. Professor, this is where I tell everybody to please be sure you subscribe and like us and review us and tell your friends. Please. But
I'll say too, we've got, over 350, I think, reviews, all 5 stars, by the way, and great comments about our dynamic, about getting truth, the hope that's there. So keep them coming wherever you get your podcasts. Those are the ones on Apple, but they're on all podcast platforms. And if you're listening on or watching on YouTube, of course, subscribe there and leave a comment and thanks
right on.
for joining us.
Well, yeah, thank you. And thank you, Corey, for being our official statistician of the show. But listen, this is getting terrifying. Kim Davis was that Kentucky clerk who refused to issue marriage licenses because it went against her Christian faith. The media, who's terrified of actually talking about the Bible, never brought up the fact that Christ of the Bible is not a homophobe and commands us to treat gay people the way we treat him. But again, this is picking and choosing, and people love to pick that one line in Leviticus that man with a man's an abomination. They don't pick the line in Leviticus 20:10 that says you have to stone adulterers to death like Mr. Trump. So it's not really a serious religious urge, but we know how these people weaponize scripture to weaponize the courts. So from a constitutional standpoint, 10 years on, how vulnerable could Obergefell v. Hodges be right now?
Unfortunately, it is vulnerable. The administration, the court, I should say, the Supreme Court of the United States, we know in the Dobbs case, took what was regarded as settled law and just ripped it apart. And we no longer have a right to abortion, which was guaranteed in Roe versus Wade. And that phrase settled law was always used to refer to Roe v. Wade. Now it's unsettled because they didn't like it. They thought it was egregiously decided. Here's what's worrying. It is true that if you talk to a lot of law professors, if you talk to a lot of practitioners, they would give an answer about whether there was any danger of reversing this case that said, well, look, the case is decided. It's a precedent. The Supreme Court's got to respect it. But that's just not how the Supreme Court works. If the Supreme Court thinks, especially this Supreme Court with its theory of originalism, there's a ruling that's contrary to the text of the Constitution, they are within their powers to reverse it as they see it. And so is gay marriage written into the Constitution? No, it's implicit in the values. That was the court's decision of the Constitution, that the 14th Amendment has fundamental rights, including a right to marriage. And the way they argued the case, there is a equal protection, a fundamental rights part of the Equal Protection Clause that says that those rights have to be applied equally. So if there's a right to marriage, they protected it even for prisoners. That's an important case. And then they extended that right to questions of gay marriage. That's how they did it. Now the Supreme Court, this Supreme Court, that Supreme Court, just led by Justice Kennedy, I should say. But the Supreme Court of the United States now could well hold up, and Justice Alito and Thomas, I know, would love to do this in particular, hold up the Constitution, its text, to that reasoning. And what do they think about Kennedy? They don't. I love that kind of reasoning. I think that opinion is one of our best and proudest moments in Supreme Court history, but they'll hold it up against the Constitution and say, egregiously wrongly decided. Where does it say the words gay marriage? I don't see it in there. And so along with the supposedly settled law of Roe versus Wade, this settled law might disappear on the grounds that, as was true for Roe, that they would say it's egregiously wrong.
I mean, so many Americans view marriage equality as a settled right. We've had 10 years of it, lots of weddings, lots of gifts. It's part of our economy now. Gay divorce, also big part of our economy. Don't take gay divorce away either, folks. But, the current court doesn't really see it as a settled right. We learned this when they talked about Roe v. Wade being settled law. That just means they want a job. It doesn't mean they're sincere people.
And if you look in, their hero of this court, I think, unfortunately, of 6 of the justices is Justice Scalia. And he wrote I would call it a vicious dissent in Obergefell, talking about why it was so wrongly decided, why it wasn't a case grounded in the text of the Constitution. And I could well see them taking, and he was an opponent of Roe v. Wade as well, taking that idea and running with it, using it to destroy this right that was so important in the court's history. I wanted to touch on the religious freedom idea that we got to earlier. Of course, in the name of religious freedom, this clerk didn't want to perform a gay marriage. That's how a lot of this gets going. And there was a jury verdict.
Not perform, just give out a license. Just give out a license. She didn't want to do her job.
And a real warping of the idea of religious freedom to claim that denying the rights of others is somehow your religious freedom.
Exactly.
That's hypocrisy, not religious freedom. But I did have a point that I was going to make about the gay marriage case specifically, which is we had an amazing event at Brown organized by my great friend and colleague Jim Marone, where we invited the 2 litigators who really won the Obergefell case, and that's David Boies and Ted Olson. And what's remarkable about those 2 lawyers is they were the 2 opposing counsels in Bush v. Gore, Boies representing Gore and Ted Olson representing Bush. And they teamed up because they believed in this idea that the principles, that it was a nonpartisan idea, the principles of the Constitution protected marriage defined equally. And that idea of marriage equality became enshrined in the Constitution as a result of their effort. But what I wanted to say that I thought you'd find it of interest, and the listeners too, is they told me in conversation, Boies in particular, that he had a strategy early on, because you have a trial level of this case before you get to the appellate level. And he wanted to get on the record opponents of marriage equality citing theocratic views, citing religious views, biblical texts. And they were onto that strategy. They knew not to do that. So now you have a different approach. I think you have a just kind of understanding that there's a place for warped biblical justification denying the rights.
But this is what makes me crazy. This is what makes me crazy. This is why I wrote my book, Professor, because again, you can't be a follower of the character of Jesus, whether he's real or not. You can't be a follower of this guy and discriminate against gay people. None of that comes from the Jesus parts of the Bible. That comes from a very flawed reading of St. Paul, who is not Jesus. And this makes me crazy, Corey, because the media will never ask them, where in your holy book does Jesus drive the gay wedding cakes from the temple? The media never says, where in your religion does it say this? And I don't really see any history of the courts doing it either. I mean, you think that you should have a sanction to discriminate because of your religious beliefs, but I've never heard of the courts demanding someone connect the dots to show me where your beliefs in Jesus Christ justify discrimination against LGBTQ taxpaying citizens. I mean, even if that was legal in our society and our founders didn't want it to be, Jesus doesn't back them up. And we're all going through this charade pretending that the Christian religion means homophobia is okay. And no one's actually asking about that text. Because it seems to me in a court of law, it's pretty black and white. Show me in the book where it says this. If you can't show it, get out of my court.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are two ideas. The first is, as you so often are educating us, that this is a warping of the Bible, that it's using the Bible with selective quotes that are, or no quotes at all, just to sort of claim that you have evidence that you don't show us. And then there's a history of the court, in thinking about religious freedom in exactly the opposite way to this clerk who's bringing the case. And the way that we think about it dates back to the founding, to the idea that we don't have an official religion, we don't have an established religion, and this is the most important point of the First Amendment, to my mind, that we don't have laws that respect or relate to, in other words, the establishment of religion. And so that's why, if it's of course great for people to have religious understandings, to think about how the ideas of freedom are reinforced by them. The fight against slavery, of course, was deeply grounded in Christianity. Martin Luther King's opposition to segregation came from a deep idea of the natural law and theology. But that's very different than saying, hey, I've got my personal belief that I cite the Bible for, and that's the only reason that I have for this law. The court has a doctrine that they call the secular purpose doctrine. It says, if you're going to have a religious belief, that's fine, but you have to be able to explain to a non-believer or a non-believer in your religion why the law is based in a common set of values. That's the idea of our Constitution, of our First Amendment. And what this clerk is really trying to do is to destroy all of that. As much as they're saying it's about the text of the Constitution, that's not it at all. It's about an idea of religion in which one group can impose on the other.
All right, so then here's the million-dollar question, Corey. This is what keeps me up at night. You ready? If Obergefell were reversed, what would that mean for the thousands and thousands of couples who are already married? I mean, could states retroactively strip away those marriages, or would it only affect new unions? Would J.D. Vance come in and command gay couples now stripped of marriage rights to return their wedding gifts? I mean, there's so many ways to be cruel, but really, what kind of mishigas might we be looking at if the Dirty Six goes ahead and does this?
Well, I think, one case that's been in the news is that the Hegseth Defense Department is trying to strip the retirement rights of a former transgender soldier. And you see the vicious...
Who have served, who have already given their service.
So the idea that states might try this, I think, is quite right, that some states might try to, in their viciousness, go after, for purely bigoted reasons, those who were enjoying marriage rights before. I think the Supreme Court's going to do something slightly more subtle, but it's not meant to reassure people. But I think they're not going to allow that. And I think that what they would say, if they wind up reversing this right to gay marriage, that they would say, we're not going to do this going backwards. We're not going to allow gay marriages going forward. That's one possibility. They could do a more limited thing too, by the way, which is to say, okay, we're fine for the clerk and say, we're not, for religious reasons, you want to object, you don't have to perform these marriages. That would be a lighter version of it. Right. But say they do the more extreme thing and they eliminate gay marriage going forward, because as I said, it's not based in the text of the Constitution, and they don't buy this idea of a fundamental right to marriage, that they don't find that in the text of the Constitution. If they did that, they might at the same time say, but we're going to respect our previous mistake, that we did have a right to gay marriage. It was wrongly decided, but we're going to protect that because we, the court, made a mistake and we'll own up to it. Now, that's not reassuring, because what it tries to do, and this is the Roberts playbook, is position the court as a moderate force. So think of an abortion debate. They say, look, we didn't ban abortion nationally. We just said that this is up to the states. And they might say, well, we didn't get rid of gay marriage for those who were married previously. We're just banning it going forward. So that kind of fake moderate position, I worry, is what they take, and that it would help them sell the decision as less than what it would be, a total radical reversal of a fundamental right.
Totally fascinating. I mean, in the bigger picture, Corey, here's the big question. What would this potential reversal signal about the court's willingness to roll back other recognized rights that we're all taking for granted? I mean, what could come next?
Well, it's hard to know. The court has a long history of using the Equal Protection Clause to protect against forms of gerrymandering that discriminate. They have possibility of pushing back in the same way that they pushed back on the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that they've used it as a kind of white rights document, even though, of course, it was meant to end segregation and subordination that was associated with segregation and slavery. They've reversed it. They might do a similar thing in the voting rights context, and in a future episode, I think we should dive into that. But the more if you want to eviscerate democracy, going after voting rights is a pretty good way to do it.
Right on. Professor, I want to thank you so much for this show. You've given so many great warnings about this democratic backsliding for years. I mean, given all these current crises we've discussed today, the militarization, attacks in the judiciary, getting rid of civil rights, Corey, what's the single most important thing that we, the people, can do right now to push back? Those of us who aren't in the legal profession, what can all of us do?
Well, I think unfortunately, when you look through American history, we have a long history of courts joining presidents in authoritarian moments. We have a long history of Congress either not fighting back or even being part of it. And so the brute reality is that the recovery of democracy hasn't come from the three branches. It's come from citizens speaking up for our basic rights. And so talking to your fellow citizens, being informed, speaking the truth as they try to blanket us, they meaning the administration and Trump, with lies. That is an act of resistance. And then over time, what I hope will do, the listeners to this podcast and others who are pushing back against this administration, is to form an alliance in electing not just people in the midterms, but a next president who is going to do more than just get rid of Trump, but who is going to try to really recover our democracy, to put back our institutions that have failed so bad, to clarify the meaning of our civil rights under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, our voting rights under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, to make it so that if we have a future president who's a criminal, as this one is, this is a criminal presidency, as I never tire of saying, that yes, a sitting president and a former one can be indicted. All of that has to be part of that discussion. And the discussion becomes now, because people often say, like, how could you have all this hope? And the answer is we have no alternative, because the alternative is giving in, and that's not an alternative at all.
Right on. Corey, what's the best way for our listeners to follow you and keep up with your brilliance all week long while we're waiting for the next episode?
Well, of course, subscribe to this podcast. Join us every week. We're lining up guests. We have an exciting lineup coming. These discussions with you, John, give me hope. Keep those ratings coming. Check out our YouTube channel. And you can also find me on Blue Sky as Democracy Prof. Check out, by the way, the promo videos that I'm doing on YouTube. Even if you listen to the station, you might enjoy watching those. Talk to me on Blue Sky. Send more questions. I'm compiling questions. John and I have been answering them. We're going to do some more soon at corey.brettschneider@gmail.com. John, I'm so excited for your book to come out too.
Thank you.
Tell listeners and people watching us, definitely buy it. John, I hope that you'll let me interview you around.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, my book is
And,
called Separation of Church and Hate, A Sane Person's Guide to Taking Back the Bible from Fundamentalist Fascists and Flock-Fleecing Frauds. And it's for believers of any faith and atheists and all agnostics, anyone who will ever have to deal with a Christian nationalist.
Thanks so much, John. What a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you all so much. I want to thank Wendy and Beowulf and everyone who puts the show together, and thank you guys for joining us on The Oath and The Office. We'll see you next week.